So yeah, good afternoon. It's Anthropology and Human Condition lecture number 15. It's the final class, it's the revision session, although I'm going to do it a little bit differently than a normal, whatever a normal revision session is. It's the 29th of December, so I hope you had a good Christmas and looking forward to New Year, not Tet, rest of the New Year, the start of the new calendar, Roman calendar year. This lecture. So I thought what I would do was sort of think about what would I write if I wrote an essay on visual anthropology and focused on Malinowski, not Sarah Pink. She's not the only visual anthropologist. There are many others, but and Malinowski's not a visual anthropologist, but I'm going to start with him as a way of revising this specific course, which kind of did a history of anthropology, and then about halfway turned into kind of a how does anthropology dig its way out of its colonial condition. Yeah, so I want to try and think about the different parts of the course and how they might fit into something organized around photography or the image and representation of the exotic other, I suppose, or the question of exoticism and the other in anthropology. That makes sense? So if you have your translation turned on, if you need it, put closed caption on. I will begin. So yeah, said all the start. So I want to start with planning an essay on visual anthropology as a sort of revision, beginning with the earliest part of the 20th century. Visual anthropology was always a part of anthropology, but it really was a part of the reinvention of the discipline in the 1980s onward. After the writing culture or critique, after the colonial critique, Anthropology in the Colonial Encounter, Tal al-Assad's great book on that made anthropology rethink itself. There were new orientations in some of the established departments, and with the advent of the arrival of more portable cameras and editing tech platforms, ethnography has been transformed, and digital economy and all of that has continued to transform what would be ethnography. So yeah, and I want to make this a way for you to think about, or for us together to think about how future versions of this course might include other things. Right? What's important, what's needed, what could be expanded. Your overall comments on this, which I'll get you to put on that e-learning in discussion time or in discussion, they will contribute to improving and changing the course as it goes forward, as actually has happened this year. For example, the class last year said they wanted more on photography, so this is it. A class before wanted more on ethics, more on the digital, more on, well, the ethics was a big discussion, and more on Vietnam. We have a few bits on Vietnam, but it's an international course, so there's not that much, and can't be for various reasons to do with me. Yeah, and well, even the rethinking of each of the older sections has been influenced by what people have said. One thing I've been thinking a lot of lately is that the whole armchair anthropology stuff at the start, Morgan, Spencer, Fraser, and so on, kind of looks a bit different now that ethnography is multi-sited and online even. So and thinking of Ruth Benedict as well, doing her fieldwork from afar about Japan, but not visiting there, that whole armchair aspect of anthropology maybe looks a bit different because we're kind of sitting in armchairs all the time now, in a way. But anyway, to think about that representation of the anthropologist on fieldwork, I, as many will do, go back to Anthropology, the Foundation of Ethnography, Anthropology's godlike foundation moment, if you like, Malinowski in his tent. And this is the famous photograph of Malinowski in his tent that graced the cover of one of the volumes related to the writing culture debate, and it was discussed by Tyler. I'm not referring to his actual essay. I'll go back and read that. But what I've been trying to do with photography in recent years with classes, not just this class, is talk about learning to read a photograph, like as a kind of grammar of photography, in a way, in the same way that we have a grammar of writing, literature, and sentences and so on. In a way, there's a grammar of the image, or at least we can learn to maybe read some of the standard tropes of the anthropological image. So we ask some kind of obvious questions, maybe. What do you first notice in the photograph? You know, what do we first notice? I've looked at this photograph many times before, so I can't think what someone might first notice, but I first noticed the silhouette of Malinowski, right? His head. Because, you know, the shape of the head, that question belongs to a version of anthropology that we no longer do, that's considered racist and outmoded, that craniology, the comparative measuring of skulls, that belongs to the worst stereotype of anthropology, that anthropology is collecting the skulls of, as I did actually find in a museum in Germany, in Heidelberg, the skulls of the Mount Hageners. We'll get to that when we talk about museums, maybe. 35 skulls. But here we have the white Caucasian skull, the brain of Malinowski, the founding brain of anthropology, and yet we see the shape of his head. Right, that's the first thing. And he's in silhouette, but he's in the foreground. Right? Well, his junk is in the foreground. What he went to his looks like tea chests and under canvas, his equipment, and it's a little bit damaged in the image in the front too. But then he's sitting at a table. We assume he's writing, perhaps typing. Yeah, he's doing anthropology anyway, right? And then we're looking at that, but we also see in the background some people. Of course, the purposes of this photograph, we don't see them as people so much, perhaps, but as Trobrianders or natives or others or non-Malinowskis. Right? That's problematic, but they are people, other people in the photograph. So when we look at as who's in the photograph, or what's the photograph about, we look a bit, it's framing, so it's inside the tent. We know that it's an indoor, it's shot from inside looking out. So the pro-filmic is the view through the tent, right? And that can say something about what anthropology is, the view through field work. But interestingly, since Malinowski also wrote about the native point of view, native, not a term we use a lot, but we can look at what the people are looking at, and they're all looking at the anthropologists. We're looking at the anthropologists, and we're looking at them looking at the anthropologists. Laura Mulvey is an interesting person. When you get into looking at film theory and so on, she'll talk about the gaze. It's part of the grammar of the image. Anyway, they're all looking at the anthropologists. Well, not quite all of them. You see the guy second from the left-hand side. It looks to me like he's looking through the tent at the camera. So he's broken the fourth wall, so to speak. No, not really, but he's looking at the camera. And of course, that should make us think, whether we do on first look, but now certainly we're learning how to think about the whole photographic scene. That must mean surely there's a person taking the photograph, because it's not like Malinowski had a selfie stick or a timer or anything. Cameras in those days were these big boxes. So someone has taken the photograph, and that's someone we turns out we know who it is. It's Billy Hancock, because Malinowski wasn't alone, even though he presented himself as being alone on the beach amongst the people. It's Billy Hancock. We see him here early on, and a bit later, and here he is helping Malinowski, and in fact taking that famous photograph of Malinowski sitting on the bench. I mean, Malinowski took a photograph as well of that scene, but what we see actually here is more clearly Billy Hancock and the assistant, who's not a Trobriand Islander. He's someone that Malinowski brought from, I think, from Melu. But anyway, yeah, that famous photograph of the white anthropologist amongst the others, the tribesmen with their exotic trinkets and so on. Malinowski sitting on the veranda, also interviewing the natives, is an interesting one, because we see this hut, this trader's hut, which I think is it's identified on the back as I forget his surname, Mick's house anyway, and that's obviously near the Trobriand village, because you can see in the background on the right hand side near the water tank a A-frame Trobriand house. But Malinowski is sitting, it looks like on a stool, because he's higher than the natives. I did at one point quip, he was on a stool there sitting on the floor. Malinowski doesn't want to get dirty because he's in his white shirt and stuff. But then I do find him in one photograph, an amazing photograph actually, sitting talking to the Trobrianders. I mean, this photo really strikes me. First of all, it's so much clearer than the others in this copy. The damaged prints of the others and the black and white kind of bad quality shots, right? They're all pretty grim, whereas this one is starkly, the contrast is up on high, and yes, it's contrast between black and white. He also looks like a really well-cooled dude. We could look at those sunglasses, and his whole, he could be a New York fashion art critic or something, right? It's, I don't know, I'm thinking John Waters or someone like that. It's not New York, he's Baltimore, but anyway, this is the anthropologist amongst the people, right? And here he's not in the trader's hut. He's definitely in a local establishment, a building, a veranda built by tying logs together, and yeah, we imagine him doing his fieldwork. So representations here, photographs that we read. Most photographs taken then you had to pose for and stay very still. So like that's what's happening both in this photograph, Malinowski on the bench, everyone's like hold still, and you have to stay still for like 30 seconds or something like that. And this one, it's Malinowski being very, very careful, posed at his desk, but he's not in a writing position, is he? He's more, maybe it's a typing position, but I just imagine him just holding still while Billy takes the photo. Assuming it's Billy here. Whereas in this one, the holding still is pretty interesting, because you see the kid who's on the right hand side there obviously wasn't holding still, and his arm is a little bit looks like it's moved in negative. Everybody else is mainly pretty still. And the guy standing, the young lad standing on the left-hand side is like just barely staying awake, I think. He's a bit bored. Everybody else is listening to anthropologists. This guy behind Malinowski looks interesting as well. He's kind of got Malinowski sitting almost on his lap, and he looks pretty skeptical. But yeah, it's the anthropologist in the midst of the native people, in amongst the exotic, and it's an unusual shot, but it's not the one that Malinowski included in his text. He included this one. I've got to get a better print of it. There must be a possibility. So first of all, I thought I'd write about photographs of anthropologists, right? I mean, we've got others. Yes. Anyone guess who this is? Do you remember? It's Claude Lévi-Strauss on the banks of the Amazon, I assume. Could be the Orinoco River, I suppose, somewhere, or the Rio. And he doesn't include photographs of himself in Tris Tropiques. He's got photographs of the Burrows and the Nambikwara and his own diagrams, his own drawings, but not a photograph of himself. This we got later. But it's interesting to see in his casual attire, and not as well dressed as Malinowski, I'd say. More relaxed, more French, you might say. And near his cooking utensils in his pretty basic kitchen there by the river where they've set up camp. Pretty interesting. And we know that Lévi-Strauss didn't do long-term field work. He went from place to place, even on these expeditions that traveled around the Amazon, trying to get further and further into the area of the Nambikwara and the Burrows, to meet the untouched tribes who he then can't really communicate with. The whole thing about the kids and so on. But that's pretty interesting that he doesn't include himself in the pictures. Neither does Margaret Mead, although she was photographed dressing up in local attire on Samoa with the young girls that were telling her stories about their sexual life. I'm sure there are things to say about this photograph. It looks slightly strange, as if they're ready to go out to a dance or something. Let's hope they're out to have fun. Slightly uncomfortable pose before anyone's really got into the festivities. So there are many photographs of anthropologists. I've written actually about I showed you a picture of Evans Pritchard with his soldiers, and I've written about Paul Rabinow and his portrayal of himself having coffee with village elders in Sidi Lakin in Morocco. So there are many, but it's not that interesting. I suppose picturing the anthropologists is significant. Here's Michael Taussig. Remember from the Surrealism chapter, we'll talk about that next. Michael Taussig with his friend and informant. Michael's here wearing a poncho or blanket over his shoulder, and it's interesting. I mean, it's a kind of trope that in the grammar of pictures of anthropologists, if there even was such a thing, you would quite often see that they wear a little bit of local regalia. Well, certainly more recent ones or American ones. Margaret Mead's gone full native here, although she can't really with white skin and so on. Evans Pritchard, Lévi-Strauss, Malinowski, they don't do that. But Tausig has a little bit. Tausig's been known to go a bit further than that as well. He had his nose pierced and put a feather through his nose once. This is not him, but this is the style of picture. This is another Burrows or Nambikwara native from that period. But Tausig, here he is an older man, the one in the green shirt, is always a bit flamboyant. Love him as I do. He's 81 years old now, and a close friend and comrade. I'm going to try and get him to give a talk at TDTU early next term in the 30-minute methods. We talked in the third week about Surrealist Anthropology, and I wanted to talk about them in relation to visual anthropology because they were very visual, the Surrealists. Obviously, they're an art movement. It's interesting that they were oppositional at the time. After World War I, Dada and then Surrealism was about anti-Europe, the destruction of European civilization. It had been this horror, awful thing, the war, and it was the rejection of every value that belonged to bourgeois society was what the Surrealists took up, especially Bataille and Larrey, who were night clubbing and drinking and going out to out on the town, so to speak, and they and others, Louis Aragon and well, Aragon was in love with Nancy Cunard, but Nancy Cunard is an artist and poet and editor in her own right, but she goes into for these exotic prints. But Surrealism was really through Picasso, I suppose, and Brancusi and sculpture. They were fascinated with exotic objects from Africa, the sculptures that transformed Cubism, right? And then Surrealism. And Larrey himself had traveled across Africa collecting these sculptures for the French museums, from Dakar in Senegal, right across the middle or with the widest part of Africa to Djibouti, sending all this stuff home. And so Surrealism was really focused on these objects, artifacts as representations of culture. And that's when it was oppositional. These were things from outside Europe that were valued, right? And were exotic and strange and different and valued for that reason. They were just different. Surrealism subsequently has been completely recuperated, a word I'll talk about later, and become like establishment. It's a part of the history of art now, and the major museums are all falling over each other to have retrospectives of Surrealism and to include, although they've excluded some artists like one, De Chirico, whose early work is approved, but whose later work gets accused of being repetitive, and then Salvador Dali. This is, I believe, a Dali tribute to De Chirico because it's got De Chirico's style arches, and it's a kind of painting of the definition of Surrealism, which is André Breton, who was the high priest, according to Bataille, of Surrealism, found in a text of Isidore Lucien Ducasse, better known as the Comte de l'Alchemont, a text that said, on the Champs de Mardereau, a text that said, that referred to, had a phrase, there was a phrase that he thought was fantastic. It was, and it gave the definition of Surrealism. This text is said, as beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine with an umbrella on an operating table. Right? That was a surreal moment. Surreal, super real. It said more about the real, but it was also unbelievable, impossible, and super real. Like a bizarre thing to mess with your head, right? An umbrella and a sewing machine, they don't meet. Well, maybe they do in houses, and so they certainly don't meet on an operating table. That was something to provoke the mind to think the impossible, right? And that's what they were about, and they were about juxtaposing things that didn't belong together in order to provoke new thoughts. And they did that either through textual games, and that's a big part of French culture, which is interesting. They did exquisite corpse and automatic writing. We did some of that in the class, the experiment of automatic writing. And they were part of a strong line of this. And some anthropologists, like James Clifford, who I'll talk about, they went back and said that some of the texts, like Malinowski's notebooks, are surrealist because they're juxtaposing things that don't belong together. His polyglot text, right? His writing is 5 languages all combined: English, Polish, Latin, German, Trobriand's, probably some others too chucked in there. And that was part of the whole, I guess, interpretive framework of culture that was recognizing that our descriptions of culture are kind of cleaned up versions of the messiness of the world. There are so many different competing, I mean, the reality of the world is polyglot, many languages, many things, many possible perspectives, but our understanding of it, our interpretation of it has to try and make sense of that and turn it into a single narrative. And that's to be questioned, the singular narratives that we put up, because they led to war and destruction and killing. And so challenging the narrative became an imperative. I mean, and that was adopted by some people who had institutional importance. It shaped some of the early ethnographic work, as well as in art movements. It shaped certainly the ethnographic museums that people like Leary sent all that material from Africa to in collections. Here's a picture of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Cambridge, I believe. And it's got some heads. I'm a bit worried about the heads, actually, because it reminds me of those heads that were in the Heidelberg Museum from Mount Hagen, and shrunken heads even. I don't know if they're carved or what. And a, looks like Tiwi Island, the figure in the middle. So Aboriginal Australia. I'm not sure if it's Tiwi Island. But museums are very interesting because of their surreal juxtaposition of things that don't necessarily go together. Why do these things go together? They're not from all the same part of the world, are they? Are they from contemporary peoples? Yes. Not some kind of ancient... they're exotic objects, and the focus on the objects themselves is a bit problematic, really, because if you just look at the representation of the material, the trinkets, the objects, the heads and so on, you don't really understand the context. You've got to think, what is the context, not just of the photograph? Somebody took this photograph and took pains to make sure their reflection in the glass wasn't showing, but also the museum has put this together, and not, there's some documentation text you can read there, but which I don't have available, but I don't know, when with this photograph of it, we don't see the context in which these heads were taken, or even how they got to a museum in England. How did they arrive? Who collected them? How were they? What was the political and economic circumstances of the making of the photograph? So that, I'm guessing, like 80 years after these things were collected, somebody can just take a casual snap of this vitrine, this cabinet of bizarre objects, because that's really without necessarily having to think about the history of colonialism and imperialism that made it possible for Europe to gather up this material from Africa, Oceania, Australia, everywhere, Asia, right? I mean, and we talked about this in a very recent lecture on comparative anthropology, the museum at the Maritime in Greenwich, which tells an interpretation of the objects, porcelain from China, and they say that's part of the tea story, with barely mentioning the opium that it's really all about, the bigger trade item was opium, and the crime of the East India Company being drug peddlers basically throughout Asia. I mean, the image, this photograph and this representation, ships and bits of porcelain, that doesn't tell the whole story. It means we need to be able to read the objects and the image of the objects with a much more of a context, the political context, and be able to read even what we read alongside the objects more critically. The text says at the same time the tea trade had a darker side, and the company used illegal opium to fund its tea business. Why doesn't that say the company grew the opium? The company grew the opium and forced Indians to grow opium instead of rice, and they starved for that reason. Why doesn't it say that this was the number one commodity that they were trading throughout Asia, and that it was the reason why someone like Ho Chi Minh was so upset with what was going on? One of the things he mentions in the 1940s, etc., etc. There are so many different contextualizing bits of information that we need to be able to really read critically these representations in the museum. I mean, that's true whether it's a critique of colonialism or not. Outside that very same museum, there's Shonibar's fourth plinth exhibit, which was moved to a plinth outside the Maritime Museum after it had done its time at Trafalgar Square, where you see an East Indiaman with looks like a 20-gun, 40-gun East Indiaman, where the sails have been replaced with the exotic fabrics of Asia and Africa. These designs that are not your usual bland white of the canvas of the colonial sailing ship, but somehow. How is this a critique of colonialism? It was meant to be a kind of juxtaposition that invoked a critique, and yet it now stands as an advertisement alongside other advertisements, as you see in the photograph, to entice people to come into the Maritime Museum, which is the museum that celebrates the colonial trade. Although it has a critique of slavery, it doesn't have a critique of or didn't have it when it first opened the traders wing. It didn't have a critique of the opium trade. It's changed that a little bit now, subsequently. But here is representation and images that get recuperated in the same way that the Surrealists recuperated to bourgeois history of art. So also sometimes the critique of colonial trade gets recuperated and watered down inside the museum, but also even here. Ship in a Bottle, which is a classic miniaturized art trope. Of course, other museums about culture and maybe not so problematic. And we talked about other boats in museums. Again, think about the Heidelberg Museum and its Trobriand canoe floating down the river after the floods of the Neckar, and being retrieved from the working class city of Mannheim and returned. None the worse for wear, actually, still floated, still good. In the History Museum here in Ho Chi Minh City, we can see a canoe from one of the ethnic minority groups of Vietnam. One of the 54, part of the big classification project, which is inspired. Representation in museums, photographs in museums and other objects, that's going to be a big theme for any discussion of visual anthropology. And of course it has been in the work of someone like James Clifford, professor of anthropology, and in America. His in History of Consciousness program at Santa Barbara, his roots, travel and translation, was largely him traveling to various museums. For example, he goes to a museum, I think it was in California, and meets the photograph of James Bosu, who gets put on the cover of his book. Whether or not James Clifford has a say in how this image was cropped, I don't know, but it's worth reading how learning to read, that images are cropped to make them look better. We all do that. We have an edit function on our phones. But for this book cover, it's very interesting to ask exactly why, what was cropped out from this image, right? So look at the cover and now look at the original image that we have. We see James Bossu was drinking beer and carrying a big stick, right? So that was cropped out, cut out. What Clifford refers to in his text is the incongruity of the bird of paradise headdress. Exotic people with feathers and flowers in their hair, right? That's the other. And the tie and cigarette. And he doesn't comment on the wider cropping of the photograph that removes the alcohol and the spear or some other kind of tool. And when he talks about James Bossu's compatriot Wala from the same selection of images, he mentions her earrings as beer can tops, but doesn't have the local knowledge to realize they're actually stubby tops. They've been ripped off exactly this kind of bottle that James Bossu is holding and used as earrings by Wala. You know, in a bit of return exotica, right? So she's got all of her other exotic items and some money tucked into them, like a dancing girl. But she's also appropriating as earrings the ring pull top of some courage bitter or whatever it's, some lager. So this is why knowing the context or being able to read the pro-filmic or the scene of photography has become important, right? And to see what happens to photographs when they're in the hands of either people or objects who are in institutions. I mean, this is right there in the photograph of Malinowski, where we find that Malinowski's staged presentation of the objects, right? This photograph of him sitting on the log with the Trobrianders, they've been asked to sit there for however many seconds, holding still with their display objects while Billy takes the photograph. And now we think of that scene of the photograph differently, often because we've had debates about it with people like Ariella Azule in her book Civil Contract of Photography, and thought very much about the responsibility of not just the person with their finger on the trigger, but also those that stand before the image and look at it. When we look at Malinowski, we as readers of that image, if reading is a metaphor that you can talk about for photographs, readers of that image should take into account that this image is staged. This is the anthropologist presenting himself among the natives, excluding certain others, aspects from the scene, and making out that this is a bit of, you know, daily life or how I did my fieldwork kind of thing. And we can learn from that, Azule's work. We can learn to read other kinds of photographs. Think of, well, this one of Tricky Dicky Nixon, the president of the USA during the high point of the war in Vietnam. Here he is. I mean, this is a photograph of him briefing the press, right? But he's very carefully staging this as well. He's in his good suit. Looks like a cheap suit to me, but anyway, he's got his papers to show that he's informed, right? And he's telling us about somewhere on the map. I guess he's looking for the what he called the bamboo Pentagon, wherever the Viet Minh headquarters were, somewhere in the jungles of Cambodia. That map, I mean, this is a room full of journalists, right? It's at the Rex Hotel here in Ho Chi Minh, where all the journalists were, and he's briefing them about the bombing that's going on. I guess it was secret bombing for a long time, but I mean, they don't just bomb Cambodia; they bomb all the way up the Ho Chi Minh Trail and Hanoi and so on. But this map is actually kind of pathetic, isn't it? It just shows Phnom Penh in Cambodia, South Vietnam, Saigon, and Hanoi, right? Any journalist would surely, these are journalists who've been working on this war for, I don't know, we're in the 15th year of the war at this stage. I'm guessing this is after 68. Like, they had no better map. I mean, they're fighting a war. Maps are really bizarre, except until you recognize that this is a prop. This is a stage prop for the staging of a photograph of the informed president who's just briefing the press on. I mean, he's it's really nothing. I mean, they've carefully put the flag behind him, the flag of the United States and the flag of Washington, I suppose. I don't know what that other flag is. It looks like a US flag. But this is the staging of the image, and it's a part of the world that we live in. We think of other staged images, which we can think. Looking at the Malinowski image allows us to think about, somebody took this photograph that we're looking at has certain effects, and we're supposed to see it as the president being informed. But of course, we don't. We know that Nixon would soon be impeached. He has to resign the presidency. He's gone. I mean, he's dead now, but he was disgraced. We call him Tricky Dicky Nixon, and he was always a bit sweaty. He lost to Kennedy because he sweated in the televised debate. But any image of a president, right? Think of the photograph of Biden, Obama, and Hillary Clinton in the Situation Room when they were watching the video footage of Osama bin Laden being executed. And they were watching a snuff film, what's called a snuff film, a film where someone dies. And they exist. And they were watching someone be executed, and then they released for publicity a photograph of themselves. Hillary's going, and the other guys are just going in the Situation Room, which doesn't look like the Situation Room on TV. I should have had that photograph to include, but I talk about it in another course. You'll see next year. The point is that all these shots are carefully selected, even if many are taken at the time by this journalist. Maybe the 35mm camera of those days could still take 36 shots in a minute or so. This one is the one that the White House would have approved to be released. And so they were well aware of the image politics, of the politics of representation here, what kind of look, what kind of effect they're trying to get, of a society that was at the time being described by theorists as the society of the spectacle. I mean, think of the Guy Debord's book. If you haven't seen it, well worth it. Short little book. I think everyone should read it. If you've read Capital, you want to read this version because it's 130 years later or so, 120 years later. Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord. And his argument is that all contemporary society is just a sea of images, and everything is recuperated into this image spectacle. I mean, people took this up and believed it, but they took it up in a fairly static way. And then for Debord, the spectacle has a history. But by 1967, when he wrote it, it was well established. I mean, it's interesting. Debord was, he was an alcoholic and he killed himself in '94. He made some amazing films though. After this, and he had been involved with the student protest in May '68, the Situationist group that was his vehicle since '62. He wrote a great telegram. You should look up the essay on the poverty of student life. It's quite entertaining. But they were in a tradition of French searching for alternative and critique of the mainstream bourgeois French society. that goes back to the Surrealists via Oulipo, ouvroir, worker, literature, literature, pouvoir, power, workers, literature, power. The Oulipo group around Raymond Queneau that did things like made books that broke poetry apart, the 100,000 poems. You see what you do here? You write 10 pages of 15 lines of poems, and then you cut them all, and by rearranging the pages in different ways, you can then have 100,000 different poems. Just a gimmick, but also kind of a profound commentary on the generation of creativity. I mean, they were, the Oulipo group, like the Lettrist International as well, were really interested in these language games that the Surrealists had initiated. Maybe Dada had started. Like there were the other ones where they did N+7, which meant you took a text. It's just a game for generating new meanings. You took a text, I don't know, the first paragraph of Capital, and every noun, so the wealth, you got a dictionary, you counted 7 words along in the dictionary, and you replaced that word with a new word. Then you got to the next noun, and then you counted in the dictionary 7 more, and you replaced. Didn't matter what dictionary you used, as long as the words were in there. And that generated some kind of new text and new meaning, if you interpret it, right? It might be absurd, it might be surreal, but sometimes it was really, it provoked new thoughts. William Burrows, the American writer from the, well, became famous in the 50s, I suppose, with the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and all of that. He was kind of a mentor to them. He would do this by cutting up newspaper articles and great literature and putting them together, half a page of a newspaper article, half a page of Proust or something, put them together and get a new line. And the idea was to break with the control of grammar, of orthodoxy, of language. And the situationists would talk about the importance of this situation right now to avoid any, well, their main anxiety was that everything would be recuperated by commodity capitalism. Everything would be turned into a commodity, and you had to be on the run to avoid that. So, you know, this is a part of the society of the spectacle. That it has a history, we actually do know, because we're talking in a different way now about representation than we were in the 60s. We're not doing 100,000 poems, but we're looking at digital and the digital humanities and creativity, using sometimes old forms like poetry or narrative online in digital form. There is a lament for the old forms of representation, and indexicality is gone from photographs because they're digital. Yeah, that's a whole other discussion, but it has to be part of it, because the assumption that a photograph is true, well, a photograph used to be, it was absolutely the case that this scene happened because there's a negative of the light from this real situation in 1916 or whenever it was, imprinted on a piece of plastic. But now we can make images, Photoshop and all sorts of digital devices to transform things that didn't ever happen. I mean, to make things that did happen look completely new by enhancing some aspects. This has been enhanced in certain ways, or to create wholly new images that we learned from painting, but are now done electronically and digitally, right? I don't have examples of that, but that's that. The indexicality of photography is gone. I mean, it was always problematic, though. I mean, the real isn't there. I mean, in the photograph, Malinowski isn't that big in real life, nor is he so flat or so black and white, right? But these are assumptions about photography that we take for granted now. We don't even see that this is part of what when we're reading a photograph, we have to learn to actually make strange those things that we interpret as like obvious. Obviously, it's a photo, so it's going to be smaller than in real life, but actually that's a reduction, because real life isn't a snapshot in time. Real life is a flow of many moments. Or even a film is, which is a flow of many snapshots in time. It isn't real in that sense. And this is one angle on the scene. There are many. The real would be 360 degrees. We have to select only some parts of the real to make even to see a photograph. And so also with the fabrications of all photographs today, whether it be Tricky Dicky Nixon or this one, which is interesting as well, because not everyone succumbs to the spectacle here. You see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people or so that are not wearing the glasses, and they all seem to be laughing. So are they laughing at everyone for putting on the spectacles, seeing things in 3D? It's the advent of 3D film in the 60s. Of course, the digital and seeing the end of indexicality and the critique of those things is in a long line of critique, right? That is about questioning everything. The credo that we learned from, Marx. We talked about Marx in the course, so let's think about him and representation. He was interested in the critique of political economy, in particular against the political economists of the East India Company at Haileybury College. And he called them penitents of Vishnu. They were beating themselves up for claiming that they had worked so hard to on the part of capitalist industriousness. So it was the industriousness of the capitalist that made value, when in fact value is the exploitation of the worker, but they couldn't see that. So Marx's critique of them and representations of workers, and of course the unwaged. And we talked about how that can even be extended today, and Marx mentions the wage in the family and the unwaged work of training workers for the wage, but doesn't really go into it as deeply as some people have subsequently. Fortunati, Silvia Federici, Camille Barbagello, right? I've given various texts for further reading about Fred Moten, Gayatri Spivak, all these things. Brett Nielsen I'll talk about briefly. Logistics, introducing logistics to this spectacle, because it has to be organized as well as see, there's two things to it. There's a structural imperial colonial commodity system organization of production, and then there's a surface level representation of it all. And that surface level representation, beverage capitalism. You know, we are presented with the narrative of, you know, it's all of us just trying to make a living, and we'll set up our startup and we'll you know, make our success through hard work and well, a bit of luck and hard work. When, you know, it's not a matter of luck and hard work that made the billionaires billionaires, because no matter how you do the math, there's no way they could have traded their way or earned their way to the billions. They are only billionaires because of some kind of theft somewhere along the line. So representation of anthropologists and of, well, starting from Malinowski in the field and thinking about him alongside others in his tent can lead to thinking about the political economy of global capital, imperialism and global capital. And I guess I want to stop with that, although I will mention my own fieldwork a little bit. Actually, I did fieldwork at the same time in Calcutta when I did my PhD fieldwork on leprosy clinic, workers in a leprosy clinic. And at the same time, Patrick Swayze was making a film about this. And here is advertising, the advert for the film. He'd given up hope. Then he discovered The City of Joy. City of Joy is a book by Dominique Lapierre about a doctor that saves young kids or whatever in Calcutta, or Kolkata as it's now called, the city formerly, it's got 7 words in its name now, Calcutta, the city formerly called Calcutta. This image itself is where indexicality falls down. See, we've got Swayze and the 3 kids in the front of the shop, and some information's been pasted over the top, the name of the film and the director and so on, Roland Joffe. And they're on the side of a river, which is the Hooghly River, a tributary of the Ganga, the Ganges, the most famous sacred river of India. And it's near, you can't quite make it out, but it's near this Howrah Bridge. Up in the top left-hand corner, you see there's this kind of structure. I'll show you a picture of Howrah Bridge itself. And so this is a famous bridge, not a very good photograph, crossing the Hooghly in North Calcutta. It's been there for many years. Maybe 1 million people cross this bridge per day. It's phenomenal. And so it was shown in this cropped image, right? Cropped, I say, not cropped. Photoshopped or cut out. So they cut out Patrick Swayze here from another scene from the film, and it's this one. You see the difference here. They flipped the position of the kids. They just reversed the negative to make the brochure. And here, Art Malik, the British Asian actor, is playing a bad guy, a gangster who's threatening the kids, cuts the girl's cheek, threatening them with, I don't know, extortion for money or something like that. He wants to sell the girl. And Patrick, the white guy, is saving them, protecting them. I mean, this changes the fear on their faces and the concern, and Patrick's changes when you look at it in the other way. We no longer see them as simply by the river. They're kind of stressing by the river. It's because they're not really by the river. They're actually in this courtyard, broken down courtyard, which is interesting because to build the set of the film, they bought all these buildings from actual poor people and moved them into a set. There's a flood scene in the film, and because no slum was slum enough for Roland Joffe, and no water was clean enough in Calcutta for Patrick Swayze to swim in it, they built a new village inside a swimming pool. So this old village here that gets flooded and Patrick has to swim through during the monsoon, was actually completely recreated. When they went round the slums of Calcutta, and they went to some guy, I want your roof, and they reeled off 3,000 rupees and gave it to him, took away his real roof and delivered a new one. And people were going, what? But that was much cheaper than building a set anywhere else. Anyway, here's Patrick. And at the time, several of the people working in the clinic that I was studying got parts as extras in the Joffe film. And Patrick's, well, it's really problematic. Here's the white guy with all the answers protecting the brown girl from the brown man, which is the classic sentence that Gayatri Spivak in Can the Subaltern Speak talks about, how so often the colonial hero is the one that protects the women from the men while exploiting both, of course. And that's the nature of anthropology. And I thought, and that's the nature of colonialism, and I thought, and the nature of anthropology. And I thought, well, Patrick Swayze is not much different to an anthropologist, is he? And I thought, and he works here in this fabricated slum, and so do I, really. In fact, I also lived with a family that didn't look that different to, in fact, I joined them all up with photocopy. I made it that we're all in the same slum together in this picture, just one happy ethnographic family. That's a bit of silliness to end, but it's the end of the course and I can be silly. And that's when I had more hair and wearing a little bit of an exotic waistcoat there. Look at that. And go see that better in the other picture. Not really. And this was in the newspaper in Calcutta, so a bit of fun. So I'll stop. Thanks for that. I've put on the e-learning some questions to start the discussion. I'll get you to move to that now, and we'll talk about it.